The morning air carried the scent of rain, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as he inspected the broken fence posts along the eastern edge of his property. Another repair he couldn't afford. He ran calloused fingers through graying hair and squinted at the horizon, where his land stretched out in neglected patches. Once, these 40 acres had been the pride of the county. Now they told a story of hardship that matched the lines on his weathered face. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built it from nothing. His father had expanded it through decades of dawn-to-dusk labor. And Thomas had inherited it along with a promise to keep the Miller legacy alive. But promises didn't pay bank loans or repair machinery. The drought had claimed last season's crops, and the one before hadn't been much better. The bank's patience was wearing thin, just like the soil beneath his boots. Thomas trudged back toward the house, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged in the middle. His wife Sarah met him at the door, her face tense with worry that she tried to disguise behind a warm smile. "Any luck with the fence?" she asked, handing him a glass of water. "It'll hold another season, I reckon." The lie tasted bitter, but he couldn't bear to add another concern to her shoulders. "How's your morning been?" "Fine." Her reply was equally dishonest. They'd been dancing this dance for months now, each pretending things weren't as dire as they were. "I checked the mail. Another letter from the bank." Thomas nodded, not needing to open it to know what it said. 3 missed payments, and counting. The thought of losing the farm tightened his chest more than any physical labor ever had. Their son Michael had moved to the city years ago, promising to send money when he could, but his teacher's salary barely covered his own bills. "I'll figure something out," Thomas said, the words hollow even to his own ears. Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "I know you will." Her faith in him had never wavered, even when his own had crumbled to dust. After lunch, Thomas drove his aging pickup truck into town. Oak Ridge was small enough that a stranger would blink and miss it. A main street with essential businesses, a diner where farmers gathered to discuss weather and prices, and a church whose steeple was the tallest structure for miles. He parked outside Henderson's feed store, steeling himself before going inside. Jim Henderson had extended him credit for months, but there was a limit to even old friendships. "Thomas," Jim greeted him with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "Just some basics today. Chicken feed and a few supplies." Thomas kept his voice casual, as if he weren't counting pennies in his head. Jim gathered the items without comment on the growing tab. As Thomas signed the credit slip, Jim cleared his throat. "There's a livestock auction tomorrow over in Fairview. Might be worth checking out. Prices have been dropping." Thomas hadn't considered selling any livestock. The few dairy cows he had left were barely producing enough for local sales, but they were essential to what little income he managed. "Not sure I have anything worth selling right now." "Wasn't thinking about selling," Jim said carefully. "Word is there's some distressed stock going cheap. Might be an opportunity to build back up." The suggestion made Thomas almost laugh. The idea of purchasing more animals when he could barely feed the ones he had seemed absurd. But he nodded politely. "I'll think about it." That evening, as Thomas and Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she brought up the auction. Jim's wife called. "She mentioned the auction to me, too." Sarah's voice was measured, the way it always was when she approached a difficult subject. "Maybe we should go, just to look." Thomas sighed. "Sarah, we can't afford more mouths to feed." "Sometimes opportunities come when you least expect them," she said, her hand finding his. "My father always said that when the path ahead seems darkest, that's when you need to keep your eyes open widest." Her father had been a man of faith and optimism, qualities that Thomas had once possessed in abundance but now struggled to find. Still, the tenderness in Sarah's eyes made it impossible to dismiss her suggestion outright. "I'll go look," he conceded, "but no promises." The auction grounds were crowded when Thomas arrived the next morning. Farmers and dealers from several counties had gathered, creating a buzz of activity that he hadn't witnessed in some time. He stood at the back, hands in his pockets, observing rather than participating. Most of the livestock looked healthy enough: dairy cows, beef cattle, a few goats and sheep. Prices were indeed lower than usual, but still far beyond what Thomas could manage. He was about to leave when the auctioneer announced the next lot. Next up, we have a horse, male, approximately 18 years old. A commotion at the side of the pen drew everyone's attention as handlers struggled to lead in an old bay gelding. The horse moved with obvious discomfort, its head hanging low, ribs visible beneath a dull coat. One of its legs bore a slight limp, and its eyes, though alert, carried a weariness that Thomas recognized all too well. "This one comes from the Davidson estate," the auctioneer continued, his enthusiasm notably diminished. "As you can see, he's seen better days. Starting bid at $100. The crowd remained silent. Even at that price, an elderly horse with health issues was a liability, not an asset. The auctioneer looked around, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Folks, this is a purebred Morgan, despite his condition. Surely worth something to someone. Do I hear $75? Still no response. Thomas felt a strange tightness in his chest as he watched the old horse standing there, awaiting judgment. There was something dignified in the way the animal held itself despite its obvious suffering. "Last call at $50 before we send him to the processing plant." Thomas wasn't sure what made him raise his hand. It certainly wasn't logic or financial sense. Perhaps it was the quiet resignation in the horse's stance, or maybe it was simply that Thomas saw himself in those tired eyes, something once valued now deemed worthless. $50, he called out, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "We have $50. Do I hear $60? The silence that followed confirmed what Thomas already knew. No one else wanted this broken-down animal. With a rap of his gavel, the auctioneer sealed the deal. Sold to the gentleman in the back. As Thomas approached to claim his purchase and complete the paperwork, he wondered how he would explain this to Sarah. They needed hay and feed, not another mouth to care for, especially one that couldn't provide milk or labor in return. The handler passed him the lead rope with a look of relief. "Good luck with this one. Name's Rusty, according to the papers." Thomas stood face to face with Rusty, who regarded him with an unexpected alertness. For just a moment something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or an understanding. "Come on, old boy," Thomas murmured. "Let's go home." The drive home seemed longer than usual, the weight of Thomas's impulsive decision growing heavier with each mile. The old horse trailer rattled behind his pickup, a loan from a neighbor that now carried a burden he could ill afford. In the rearview mirror, dust billowed from the dry country road, obscuring his view of what lay behind. If only the future could be so easily hidden. Thomas rehearsed explanations in his mind, trying to find words that would make Sarah understand. They'd agreed long ago that major decisions would be made together, especially now, when every dollar mattered. Yet here he was, bringing home an aging horse that would consume resources without providing anything in return, except perhaps company in misery. As he turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the farm, Thomas saw Sarah standing on the porch, one hand shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. Her posture stiffened when she noticed the trailer. He parked near the barn and sat for a moment, gathering courage before stepping out to face her. "What's this?" Sarah asked, approaching with cautious steps. There was no anger in her voice, only a carefully measured curiosity that somehow made Thomas feel worse. "I made a mistake," he admitted, shoulders slumping. "There was this horse at the auction. Nobody wanted him. They were going to send him for processing." The words tumbled out in a jumble of explanation and apology. Sarah moved past him to the trailer and peered inside. Rusty stood motionless, head bowed as if awaiting judgment. "He's in rough shape," she observed, her voice softening. "I know. I don't know what I was thinking. We can't afford—" "Open the trailer," Sarah interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. Thomas complied, lowering the ramp with a clatter that made Rusty flinch. Sarah clicked her tongue soothingly and extended her hand. The horse regarded her warily before taking a tentative step forward, then another, until he stood on solid ground once more. In the full light of day, his condition appeared even worse. Patches of hair missing from his coat, hooves in need of trimming, and a dullness in his bay coloring that spoke of neglect. "How much?" Sarah asked, running her hand along Rusty's neck. $50, Thomas admitted, bracing for her reaction. To his surprise, Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Not much for a life. She looked up at her husband, a complex emotion in her eyes that Thomas couldn't quite decipher. "We'll manage." Relief washed over Thomas, followed quickly by a surge of affection for this woman who, after 30 years of marriage, could still surprise him with her capacity for compassion. "I'll make it work," he promised. "Maybe he can help around the farm when he's stronger." Sarah's smile held a hint of sadness. Maybe. They both knew it was unlikely the horse would ever be strong enough for farm labor, but the pretense gave them comfort. They led Rusty to the small paddock beside the barn, an area once used for horses when the farm had been prosperous enough to keep them. The fence needed repair in places, but it would hold for now. Thomas filled a trough with water while Sarah found an old brush in the barn and began gently removing the worst of the dirt and loose hair from Rusty's coat. "He's been through something," Sarah murmured, her fingers discovering a pattern of old scars along the horse's flank. These didn't come from natural causes. Thomas felt a flare of anger toward whoever had mistreated the animal. "Well, he's safe now," he said firmly, surprised by his own protectiveness toward a creature he'd known for mere hours. As evening approached, Thomas mixed a small portion of the feed he'd purchased for the cows, adding some oats he'd found in the back of the barn. Rusty ate slowly, deliberately, his movements suggesting a care and precision that seemed at odds with his ragged appearance. Later, as Thomas and Sarah sat at their kitchen table, the financial reality of their situation couldn't be ignored. Bills were spread before them like a bleak landscape, numbers that refused to align with the meager income from milk sales and odd jobs. "We could sell the North Field," Sarah suggested, not for the first time. "The Johnsons have been interested for years." Thomas shook his head stubbornly. "That land's been in my family since my grandfather cleared it. I won't be the one to let it go." Sarah didn't press the issue. She understood his attachment to the land went beyond rational calculation. Instead, she gathered the bills into a neat stack. "We'll find another way. We always do." That night, Thomas lay awake long after Sarah's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The moonlight filtered through thin curtains, casting pale shadows across their bedroom. Outside, an owl called, its lonesome cry echoing the emptiness Thomas felt inside. He had always prided himself on being a provider, a protector. Now, with the farm failing and debts mounting, he felt like a fraud. And adding an elderly, injured horse to their burdens seemed like the final proof of his poor judgment. Yet something about the animal had spoken to him. There had been intelligence in those eyes, a quiet dignity that had cut through Thomas's defenses. In saving Rusty, perhaps he'd been trying to save something of himself, the part that believed in second chances and unexpected grace. Thomas rose before dawn the next morning, as he had every day of his adult life. The routine of farm work was both a comfort and a burden, milking the small herd of cows, checking fences, repairing what he could with materials on hand. But today, he added a new task, visiting Rusty in the early light. The horse stood at the fence, ears pricked forward as if he'd been waiting. Thomas approached with an apple he'd saved from their dwindling supply, holding it out on his palm. Rusty accepted the offering with surprising gentleness, his whiskers tickling Thomas's hand. "Well, old boy," Thomas said, "I reckon we've both seen better days." As he spoke, he noticed something he'd missed in the commotion of the previous day. Around Rusty's neck, partially hidden by his mane, was a thin leather cord. Thomas carefully brushed the hair aside, revealing a small leather pouch, weathered and cracked with age. Curious, he untied it and peered inside. The pouch contained a tarnished metal object, about the size of a silver dollar. Thomas turned it over in his palm, wiping away years of grime with his thumb. It appeared to be a medallion of some sort, with intricate engravings that time had not completely erased. In the center was what looked like a family crest, a shield with symbols he didn't recognize. "What's this you're carrying?" Thomas murmured, more to himself than to the horse. Rusty nickered softly, as if responding to the question. Thomas slipped the medallion into his pocket, intending to examine it more closely later. For now, there was work to be done, endless work that never seemed to bring the farm any closer to salvation. Yet as he went about his chores, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the mysterious object and the equally mysterious horse who had carried it. That afternoon, while repairing a section of fence near the road, Thomas spotted a sleek black car slowing as it approached the farm. It was an unusual sight. Expensive vehicles rarely had reason to venture this far from town. The car stopped, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out, looking decidedly out of place against the backdrop of the struggling farm. "Mr. Miller?" the stranger called, approaching with measured steps. "Thomas Miller?" Thomas straightened, setting down his tools. "That's me." The man extended a manicured hand. "Daniel Harrington. I was hoping we might have a conversation about a horse you recently acquired." Thomas felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. How could this stranger know about Rusty, purchased just yesterday? And more importantly, why would someone like him, clearly wealthy and powerful, have any interest in a broken-down old horse that no one else had wanted? "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas lied, instinctively protective. Harrington smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "I think you do, Mr. Miller, and I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for that animal." Thomas's fingers tightened around the fence post he had been securing. The stranger's presence felt like an invasion, and his interest in Rusty stirred an unexpected protectiveness in Thomas's chest. He studied Daniel Harrington's face, noting the calculated patience in his expression, and the way his eyes constantly scanned the property, assessing and evaluating. "How did you know I bought a horse?" Thomas asked, deciding that complete denial was pointless. Harrington's smile widened slightly. "News travels in small communities, Mr. Miller. I have connections at the auction house. When I heard about the sale, I thought I should come see you personally." Thomas wiped his hands on his worn jeans, buying time to think. He was keenly aware of his own appearance: sweat-stained shirt, mud-caked boots, calloused hands, in contrast to Harrington's immaculate presentation. "The horse isn't for sale," he said finally. "I just got him yesterday." "I understand completely." Harrington nodded, his tone smoothly transitioning to one of sympathetic understanding. "Attachments form quickly, but I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for the animal. Cash today." The amount hit Thomas like a physical blow. $5,000 would cover the overdue mortgage payments and buy them months of breathing room. It was more than 10 times what any reasonable person would pay for an elderly, injured horse. The very extravagance of the offer confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect. There was something special about Rusty, something this man wanted badly. "Why?" Thomas asked bluntly. "Why would you pay that much for an old horse?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Harrington's face before his practiced smile returned. "Let's just say I have a soft spot for Morgans. I operate a sanctuary for retired horses, and I believe this particular animal would fit well in my program." The explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but Thomas didn't believe it for a second. He thought of the medallion in his pocket and wondered if it was connected to Harrington's unusual interest. "That's very generous," Thomas said carefully, "but I'm not looking to sell right now. My wife's grown attached to him." Harrington's smile faded. "Mr. Miller, I don't think you understand your situation. That horse was never meant to end up at a public auction. There was a misunderstanding with the Davidson estate. I'm simply trying to rectify an error." "Well, no error on my part," Thomas replied, his voice hardening. "I paid fair and square. The horse is mine." 10,000, Harrington said abruptly. "Final offer. I can have the cash delivered this afternoon." For a moment, Thomas wavered. The amount would not only cover their immediate debts, but would also provide capital for much-needed improvements to the farm. Sarah would never have to worry about bill collectors again. At least, not for a long while. All for an animal he barely knew, one that by rights he should never have purchased in the first place. But something in Harrington's eagerness, the barely concealed desperation beneath his polished veneer, made Thomas hesitate. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Harrington, but my answer is still no. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish before sundown." Harrington's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake, Miller. One you might regret." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, which he held out between two fingers. "When you change your mind, and you will, call this number." Thomas took the card without looking at it, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Good day to you, sir." After a tense moment, Harrington turned and walked back to his car. The vehicle's engine purred to life, and it rolled away down the dusty road, leaving Thomas alone with a growing sense of unease. He pulled the medallion from his pocket and examined it again. What could this tarnished piece of metal possibly be worth to make a man offer $10,000 for the horse that carried it? When Thomas returned to the house for lunch, he found Sarah at the kitchen table, a worried expression on her face. "There was a phone call," she said without preamble. "A woman asking about the horse. She wouldn't leave a name, just said it was urgent that we contact her before making any decisions." Thomas sank into a chair, suddenly weary. "A man came by earlier, offered $10,000 for Rusty." Sarah's eyes widened. "10,000? Thomas, that's—" "I know what it is," he interrupted. "It's too much, way too much for an old horse, unless there's something we don't know." He placed the medallion on the table between them. "Found this around his neck this morning." Sarah picked up the object, turning it over in her hands. "It looks old. Valuable, maybe?" "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "But valuable enough to justify that kind of offer? I don't think so. There's something else going on." They sat in silence for a moment, the medallion resting on the worn wooden table like a question neither of them could answer. "What did you tell him?" Sarah finally asked. "Told him the horse wasn't for sale." Thomas watched her face carefully, wondering if she would challenge his decision. To his relief, Sarah nodded slowly. "I think that was right. Something feels wrong about this whole situation." She pushed a plate of sandwiches toward him. "Eat something. Then we should check on Rusty." After lunch, they walked together to the paddock. Rusty stood in the shade of an old oak tree, his posture more relaxed than it had been the day before. He lifted his head at their approach, ears forward with what appeared to be recognition. "He's looking better already," Sarah observed, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. "Just a little proper care makes a difference." Thomas noticed that Sarah had filled the water trough and put out fresh hay. She'd even hung an old salt lick in the corner of the paddock, small gestures of care that reinforced his growing suspicion that, despite their practical concerns, neither of them was eager to part with Rusty. "We should probably have Dr. Reynolds take a look at him," Thomas suggested, referring to the local veterinarian. "Make sure there's nothing serious wrong with that leg." "I already called," Sarah admitted with a slight smile. "He's coming by tomorrow morning." Thomas wasn't surprised. Sarah had always been the more proactive one, handling the details while he focused on the broader challenges of keeping the farm running. It was a partnership that had sustained them through good times and bad. As they stood watching Rusty graze, a vehicle approached on the road, not the sleek car from earlier, but a weathered pickup truck that Thomas recognized as belonging to Jim Henderson from the feed store. "Now what?" Thomas muttered, moving toward the driveway to meet their visitor. Jim parked and got out, his expression unusually serious. "Thomas, Sarah," he greeted them with a nod. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Sarah assured him. "Is everything all right?" Jim shifted uncomfortably. Not sure, to be honest. Couple of strangers came by the store asking questions about you two, specifically about any new livestock you might have purchased. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. What did you tell them? Thomas asked. Nothing much. Said I minded my own business and suggested they do the same. Jim looked past them toward the paddock where Rusty was visible. That the horse you bought at the auction? Thomas nodded. Thought so. One of them showed me a picture, asked if I'd seen him around. Jim removed his cap and ran a hand through thinning hair. Thomas, what kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into? Wish I knew, Thomas replied honestly. All I did was buy a horse nobody wanted. Jim replaced his cap, his expression troubled. Well, whatever it is, watch yourself. These folks didn't strike me as the type who take no for an answer. Thought you should know they're asking around. After Jim left, the afternoon stretched out in a strange state of suspended tension. Thomas attempted to focus on his chores, but his mind kept returning to Harrington's visit and Jim's warning. Sarah, too, seemed preoccupied as she moved through her daily tasks, pausing occasionally to glance down the road as if expecting more unwelcome visitors. By evening, no one else had appeared, but the sense of being watched remained. As darkness fell, Thomas took extra care in securing the farm buildings, checking locks that hadn't been used in years. In the paddock, he made sure Rusty had fresh water for the night and spent a few minutes simply standing with the horse, one hand resting on his neck. What's your story, old boy? He murmured. What makes you so special to these people? Rusty shifted slightly, leaning into Thomas's touch. In the fading light, his eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond that of an ordinary animal, as if he understood every word and might answer if he could. Later, as Thomas and Sarah prepared for bed, he found himself standing at the window, peering out into the darkness. The farm lay quiet under a blanket of stars, peaceful in a way that belied the day's strange events. Come to bed, Sarah called softly. Whatever's happening, we'll face it together in the morning. Thomas nodded, drawing the curtains closed. But as he lay beside his wife in the darkness, sleep eluded him. The medallion sat on the nightstand, its presence a constant reminder that something extraordinary had entered their lives, something that might prove to be either their salvation or their undoing. Dr. Reynolds arrived shortly after breakfast, his ancient Jeep bumping along the uneven driveway. He was a stout man in his 60s with a perpetual squint and hands that had tended to the county's livestock for over 3 decades. Thomas had always appreciated the vet's direct manner and genuine concern for animals, qualities that went beyond business transactions. Morning, Miller family, Reynolds called as he climbed out of his vehicle, medical bag in hand. Sarah tells me you've acquired a new patient for me. Thomas nodded, leading the way to the paddock. Bought him at the auction yesterday. Not sure what I was thinking, but here we are. Reynolds chuckled. The heart has reasons that reason knows nothing of, as they say. His smile faded as they approached Rusty. My word, this fellow's seen some hard times. The horse regarded the newcomer with wary interest, nostrils flaring slightly as he caught the vet's scent. Reynolds moved slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones as he approached. Years of experience had taught him how to earn an animal's trust, and within minutes, Rusty was allowing him to run practiced hands along his neck and flanks. Let's have a look at that leg, Reynolds murmured, bending to examine the source of Rusty's limp. Old injury, poorly healed. Not much to be done about that now, I'm afraid. But it doesn't seem to cause him severe pain. The examination continued methodically, with Reynolds checking Rusty's eyes, teeth, and overall condition. Thomas and Sarah stood nearby, awaiting the verdict with mingled hope and apprehension. Well, Reynolds said finally, straightening up. He's malnourished and showing signs of neglect, but nothing that good care won't improve. The leg will always give him trouble, but with proper diet and moderate exercise, he could have several comfortable years ahead. He paused, a curious expression crossing his face. Interesting markings on his shoulder. Almost looks like a brand, but not like any I've seen before. Thomas stepped closer. Under Rusty's rough coat, partially obscured by dirt and old scars, was a faint pattern on the skin. "I didn't notice that before," he admitted. "Needs a good wash to see it properly," Reynolds suggested. "Could help identify his origins, if you're curious." The vet rummaged in his bag, producing several bottles and packages. "Here's some supplements to help with his nutrition. Mix them with his feed once a day, and this salve should help with those patches of missing hair." As Thomas reached for his wallet, Reynolds waved him off. "Put it on your tab. Times are tough all around." His kind eyes held no judgment, only understanding. After the vet departed, Thomas filled a bucket with warm water and, with Sarah's help, began the process of bathing Rusty. The horse seemed to enjoy the attention, standing patiently as they worked the grime from his coat. As the layers of dirt washed away, the marking on his shoulder became clearer, an intricate design that resembled a stylized letter D with flourishes that curled around it like vines. "Davidson," Sarah murmured, recalling what they'd been told at the auction. "He came from the Davidson estate." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "But who are the Davidsons, and why would someone like Harrington offer a small fortune for this horse?" Before Sarah could respond, the sound of tires on gravel announced another visitor. Thomas tensed, fearing Harrington had returned, but it was a different vehicle, a modest sedan that he didn't recognize. A middle-aged woman emerged, her posture straight and purposeful. She wore simple but well-made clothes, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," she called, approaching the paddock. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I'm Eleanor Davidson." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances of surprise. "Davidson," Thomas repeated. "As in—" "Yes," the woman confirmed, her gaze moving to Rusty. "I see you have my father's horse." There was an awkward silence as Thomas and Sarah absorbed this information. Finally, Thomas found his voice. "I bought him legally at the auction. I have the paperwork." Eleanor Davidson's expression softened. "I'm not here to dispute that, Mr. Miller. The auction was legitimate, though it should never have happened." She approached the fence, extending a hand toward Rusty, who nickered softly in apparent recognition. "Hello, old friend. You remember me, don't you?" The tenderness in her voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt a twinge of sympathy. "You want him back?" he stated, rather than asked. "It's complicated," Eleanor sighed. "May we talk somewhere? There's much to explain." They settled at the kitchen table, where Sarah offered their unexpected guest coffee. Eleanor accepted gratefully, wrapping her hands around the mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. "My father, Edward Davidson, passed away 3 months ago," she began. "He was a collector of historical artifacts and rare manuscripts, particularly those related to early American history. Rusty was his companion for over 15 years. Thomas nodded encouragingly, sensing there was much more to the story. "When Father died, his estate should have come to me, his only child. But there were complications. A distant cousin contested the will, claiming Father had promised him certain items of value." Eleanor's mouth tightened at the memory. "While the legal battle continues, the court appointed an executor to manage the estate. This man, Vernon Wallace, has been selling off assets without proper authority, including Rusty." "Is that why people are so interested in the horse?" Sarah asked, gently. "Because the sale wasn't legal?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Not exactly. The interest in Rusty goes deeper than ownership disputes." She looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "Did you find anything with him? Anything unusual?" Thomas exchanged a quick glance with Sarah before reaching into his pocket and withdrawing the medallion. "Just this. It was in a pouch around his neck." Eleanor drew a sharp breath. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. Thomas placed the medallion in her palm. Eleanor examined it with reverent care, her fingers tracing the worn engravings. "It's one of a pair," she said softly. "Family heirlooms from the Revolutionary War period. My father spent decades researching their history and significance." "What are they?" Sarah asked, leaning forward with interest. According to family legend, they're keys of sorts. My ancestor, Jonathan Davidson, was a patriot who worked closely with Washington's intelligence network. These medallions, when combined, supposedly reveal the location of something valuable that was hidden during the British occupation of Philadelphia in 1777. Thomas frowned, skeptical. Hidden treasure? That sounds like a children's story. I understand your doubt, Eleanor nodded. My father was a serious historian, not a treasure hunter, but his research led him to believe there might be truth to the legend. The medallions bear markings that align with certain maps and documents from the period. And this is why someone offered me $10,000 for Rusty, Thomas asked. Because of this medallion? Eleanor's eyes widened. 10,000? Who made this offer? A man named Harrington, Daniel Harrington, showed up yesterday, very insistent. Eleanor's face paled. Daniel Harrington is the cousin I mentioned, the one contesting Father's will. He's been after the medallions for years, convinced they'll lead to a fortune. Father never trusted him, which is why She trailed off, looking troubled. Why he what? Sarah prompted gently. Why he separated the medallions before his death. He gave one to me directly, bypassing the will entirely. The other, her eyes drifted toward the window, where Rusty could be seen grazing in the paddock. The other he entrusted to his most loyal companion. Thomas leaned back in his chair, processing this information. It seemed fantastical, like something from a movie rather than real life. Yet the urgency of Harrington's offer and the presence of Eleanor Davidson lent credibility to the tale. So what happens now? He asked. Harrington knows the horse is here. He'll be back. Eleanor nodded gravely. Yes, he will. And he won't be deterred easily. Daniel has resources and few scruples about how he uses them. She hesitated, then continued with visible reluctance. I hate to ask this of you, but would you consider selling Rusty to me? I can offer a fair price. Not what Harrington promised, but enough to compensate you properly. The request hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at Sarah, seeing in her expression the same conflicted emotions he felt. On one hand, this woman clearly had a legitimate connection to Rusty, and returning him to her care seemed right. On the other hand, there was something about the old horse that had already worked its way into their hearts. We need time to think about it, Sarah said finally. This is all very sudden. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Of course, I'm staying at the Oak Ridge Inn for a few days. She reached into her purse and produced a business card. My contact information. Please let me know your decision as soon as possible. She rose to leave, then paused, her expression earnest. Whatever you decide, be careful. Daniel Harrington is not someone to underestimate. After showing Eleanor out, Thomas and Sarah returned to the kitchen, the medallion lying between them on the table like a physical manifestation of their dilemma. What do you think? Thomas asked, his voice low despite the fact that they were alone. Sarah traced the edge of the medallion with her fingertip. I believe her story. The question is, what do we do about it? Thomas gazed out the window at Rusty, who had moved to the shade of the oak tree. I don't know, but I have a feeling we need to decide quickly. Night descended on the farm, bringing with it a stillness that felt deceptive after the day's revelations. Thomas sat on the porch steps, the medallion in his palm catching the moonlight. Inside, Sarah was making phone calls, quietly checking Eleanor Davidson's story with contacts in town. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford, not with so much at stake. The distant hoot of an owl punctuated the cricket chorus, and Thomas found himself envying the simplicity of their world. His had become infinitely more complicated in the span of 48 hours. Revolutionary war secrets, contested wills, and shadowy figures offering small fortunes. It was as if he'd stumbled into someone else's story. Yet here he was, a struggling farmer with overdue mortgage payments, suddenly holding what might be a key to historical treasure. The irony wasn't lost on him. A soft nickering drew his attention to the paddock, where Rusty stood at the fence, silhouetted against the night sky. On impulse, Thomas pocketed the medallion and walked over to the horse. Can't sleep either, huh? He murmured, reaching out to stroke the animal's neck. Rusty leaned into his touch, a gesture of trust that moved Thomas unexpectedly. "What are we going to do with you, old boy?" The screen door creaked, and Sarah joined him by the paddock. "Just got off the phone with Marge at the county records office," she said, her voice low. "The Davidson estate is indeed tied up in litigation. Eleanor's story checks out so far." Thomas nodded, not surprised. "What about Harrington?" "He's real too. Boston businessman, made his fortune in real estate development, has a reputation for aggressive acquisitions." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "Marge says there are rumors he's had financial setbacks recently. Might explain his desperation to find this supposed treasure." "If it even exists," Thomas reminded her. "If it exists," she agreed. "But someone believes it does. Enough to offer $10,000 for this horse." They stood in companionable silence, watching Rusty graze in the moonlight. Despite his still evident limp and poor condition, there was a dignity to the old horse that commanded respect. "We should give him back to Eleanor," Thomas said finally. "She obviously cares for him, and he belongs with someone who knew him before." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Is that what you want to do?" Thomas sighed. "Want? No. What I want is to keep him here, fix up the farm with Harrington's money, and tell them all to leave us alone. But that's not going to happen, is it?" "Probably not," Sarah admitted. "This is bigger than us, Thomas. These people won't just go away." Before Thomas could respond, the distant beam of headlights caught their attention. A vehicle was approaching down the long country road that passed their farm, moving slowly, its lights cutting through the darkness. "Expecting anyone?" Sarah asked, tension evident in her voice. Thomas shook his head, squinting to make out the vehicle as it drew nearer. It wasn't Harrington's sleek sedan or Eleanor's modest car, but a larger, more utilitarian vehicle, possibly a truck or SUV. "Get inside," Thomas instructed, suddenly alert to potential danger. "Lock the doors." Sarah hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go on now." As Sarah reluctantly headed for the house, Thomas moved toward the barn, where he kept a shotgun for predators. He had never used it against a person, and hoped he wouldn't need to now. But the strange vehicle crawling toward his property at this hour set off every alarm in his mind. The vehicle, a dark SUV he could now see, stopped at the entrance to his driveway but didn't turn in. For several long moments, it simply idled there, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. Thomas remained perfectly still in the shadows of the barn, shotgun at his side, watching and waiting. Finally, the SUV's engine revved, and it continued down the road, disappearing around a bend. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A warning, perhaps, or simple surveillance. Either way, the message was clear. They were being watched. When he returned to the house, Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, face pale with worry. "Who was it?" she asked. "Don't know. They didn't stop, just drove by slowly. Could be nothing." But they both knew it wasn't nothing. It was another piece of the increasingly concerning puzzle surrounding Rusty and the medallion. "We need to make a decision, Thomas. Soon." He nodded grimly. "First thing in the morning I'll call Eleanor. Tell her we're ready to discuss terms." Sleep was fitful at best that night. Thomas woke repeatedly, each creak of the old farmhouse sending him into high alert. By dawn he was exhausted but resolved. After completing essential morning chores, he called the number on Eleanor's card. "Mr. Miller," she answered, sounding relieved. "I was hoping you'd call." "We need to meet," Thomas said without preamble. "Not here, though. Somewhere public." There was a pause, then. "The diner in town, 11 o'clock? We'll be there." Thomas hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and regret. Selling Rusty was the sensible solution to a problem that was rapidly growing beyond their control, yet the decision sat uneasily with him. As they prepared to leave for town, Thomas insisted on moving Rusty to the inner stable, where he would be less visible from the road. The horse seemed to sense the tension, following Thomas with unusual docility. "We're doing the right thing," Sarah reassured him as they locked the stable door. "For all of us." Thomas nodded, though the hollow feeling in his chest persisted. They drove to town in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The diner was busy with the usual late-morning crowd, farmers taking a break from fieldwork, retirees nursing endless cups of coffee, and the occasional traveler passing through. Eleanor was already there, seated in a corner booth that offered a view of both the entrance and the parking lot. Her expression brightened when she saw them, though anxiety lingered in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as they slid into the booth across from her. "Have you made a decision?" Thomas glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "We're willing to sell Rusty back to you, Ms. Davidson, but we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. No more half-truths or vague references to treasure." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's fair." She opened her purse and withdrew an object wrapped in soft cloth. Carefully unfolding it, she revealed a medallion identical to the one Thomas carried, except this one appeared to be made of gold rather than silver. This is what Daniel is really after. Thomas removed his own medallion from his pocket, placing it beside Eleanor's on the table. The similarity was unmistakable, though his was tarnished and worn compared to the gleaming golden twin. "My father believed these medallions, when properly aligned, form a map of sorts," Eleanor explained in hushed tones. "The engravings create a pattern that corresponds to landmarks in Philadelphia. According to his research, they lead to a cache of documents and possibly gold that was hidden by patriots during the Revolutionary War." "And this cache? It's valuable?" Sarah asked. "Historically priceless," Eleanor confirmed. "And if the gold is there as described in my father's notes, it would be worth millions in today's market." Thomas exhaled slowly, the enormity of the situation sinking in. No wonder Harrington is so determined. "It's not just about the monetary value for Daniel," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "It's about winning, about taking what he believes should be his. He's obsessed with the idea that my father favored me unfairly." "Did he?" Thomas asked bluntly. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "My father and I had our differences, but we reconciled before his death. Daniel never forgave him for perceived slights decades ago. It's become an unhealthy fixation." Sarah, ever practical, steered the conversation back to immediate concerns. "What happens if we sell you Rusty? Will that end this for us?" Eleanor's hesitation was answer enough. "Daniel knows you have the medallion now. He won't simply forget about it." "So we're targets either way," Thomas concluded grimly. "I'm afraid so." Eleanor reached across the table, her expression earnest. "But I can offer protection. A place for you to stay while this is resolved. Financial compensation for your trouble." Thomas shook his head. "We're not leaving our farm." "Then let me help you secure it," Eleanor insisted. "I have resources too, Mr. Miller. Not like Daniel's perhaps, but enough to ensure your safety." As they discussed options, Thomas noticed a familiar black car pulling into the diner's parking lot. "Harrington," he muttered, nodding toward the window. Eleanor quickly wrapped her medallion and returned it to her purse. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. Daniel Harrington entered the diner, his gaze immediately finding their table. A cold smile spread across his face as he approached, flanked by two men whose bulky jackets likely concealed weapons. "Eleanor," he greeted with false warmth, "and the Millers. How convenient to find you all together." He pulled up a chair from a nearby table, seating himself at the end of their booth uninvited. "I trust you're discussing our mutual interest?" Eleanor's face was a mask of controlled hostility. "There's nothing mutual about it, Daniel. Father never intended for you to have the medallions." "A misunderstanding that the courts will soon rectify," Harrington replied smoothly. His attention shifted to Thomas. "Have you reconsidered my offer, Mr. Miller? I'm prepared to be even more generous now. Say, $15,000 for the horse and whatever trinkets came with him." The casual increase of $5,000, mentioned as if it were pocket change, emphasized the disparity between Harrington's world and Thomas's reality. It was tempting, desperately so, but Thomas found himself shaking his head. "Not interested," he said firmly. Harrington's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened to flints of ice. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Miller. This isn't really a choice. You're simply deciding how difficult you want to make things for yourself and your lovely wife." The threat hung in the air, causing several nearby diners to glance over nervously. The atmosphere in the previously bustling restaurant grew tense, conversations dropping to murmurs. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Harrington?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear Thomas could see in her eyes. "Merely stating facts," Harrington replied. "The medallions will be mine, one way or another. How much collateral damage occurs in the process is entirely up to you." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough, Daniel. These people have nothing to do with our family dispute. They involved themselves the moment he bought that horse," Harrington snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. "A horse that should never have been sold in the first place." Thomas stood abruptly, towering over the seated Harrington. "We're leaving now. I suggest you don't follow us." For a tense moment, it seemed Harrington might escalate the confrontation. Then, with deliberate casualness, he leaned back in his chair. "By all means, go. But remember what I said. 15,000 is my final offer, available for the next 24 hours only. After that..." He spread his hands in a gesture of regret. "Well, things become much less civilized." Thomas helped Sarah from the booth, and Eleanor quickly gathered her belongings. As they walked toward the exit, Thomas felt Harrington's gaze boring into his back, a promise of trouble to come. Outside in the parking lot, Eleanor gripped Thomas's arm urgently. "He's not bluffing. Daniel will take what he wants, regardless of who gets hurt." "Then what do you suggest?" Thomas asked, his mind racing with limited options. Eleanor glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Come to my hotel room. We need to examine the medallions properly, understand what we're dealing with. It might be our only leverage." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Lead the way. We'll follow in our truck." As they pulled out of the diner parking lot, Thomas noticed Harrington watching from the window, cell phone pressed to his ear. The game was escalating, and they were pieces being moved across a board whose dimensions they were only beginning to understand. Eleanor's hotel room was modestly furnished but clean, with generic landscape paintings adorning beige walls. She drew the curtains closed as soon as they entered, casting the room into a dim half-light that matched the gravity of their situation. Thomas felt out of place, his work boots leaving faint traces of dirt on the carpeted floor. "Please sit." Eleanor gestured toward the small table by the window. She moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis, retrieving a leather portfolio from her suitcase. "I brought some of my father's research. It might help us understand what we're dealing with." Thomas and Sarah settled into the chairs while Eleanor spread several documents across the table. Photocopies of yellowed letters, hand-drawn maps, and meticulously detailed notes in elegant cursive. "My father spent most of his life studying early American history," Eleanor explained, her finger tracing a line of text on one of the pages. "His particular focus was the Revolutionary period, especially the network of spies and intelligence operatives that Washington relied upon." "And how do the medallions fit into this?" Sarah asked, leaning forward to examine a sketch that clearly depicted the two identical metal discs. Eleanor selected a document that appeared to be a photocopy of a journal entry. "According to my father's research, these medallions were created by Jonathan Davidson, my ancestor, who served as a courier for Washington's spy network. They were designed as a safeguard for sensitive documents and valuables that needed to be hidden from British forces." Thomas removed his medallion from his pocket and placed it on the table. "How exactly do they work?" Eleanor reached for her purse and withdrew her own golden medallion. "They're meant to be overlaid in a specific alignment. The combined pattern supposedly corresponds to a map of Philadelphia as it existed in 1777. She positioned the two medallions side by side, their intricate engravings catching the light from the window. "Father believed that when properly aligned, They would reveal the location of a hidden cache of documents and gold that the Continental Congress secreted away during the British occupation. Thomas frowned skeptically. Seems like a complicated way to leave directions. It was wartime, Eleanor reminded him. If captured, a traditional map could be easily understood by the enemy. These medallions would appear to be mere decorative objects to anyone who didn't know better. She paused, running her finger along the edge of the golden disc. Besides, there was always the risk of betrayal within the ranks. This method ensured that only someone with both medallions could find the location. And your father, did he ever try to find this treasure himself? Sarah asked. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. He spent years piecing together the historical record, but the medallions were separated for generations. The silver one was lost until about 20 years ago, when he tracked it down through an antiquities dealer. By then he was already ill. She trailed off, lost momentarily in private grief. He never got the chance to pursue the search properly. Thomas picked up his medallion again, feeling its weight in his palm. What had seemed like a tarnished trinket hours ago now felt heavy with history and expectation. So what's the plan? We hand these over to you and hope Harrington leaves us alone. Eleanor shook her head firmly. That won't work. Daniel knows you have the silver medallion now. As long as he believes that, you're at risk. She met Thomas's gaze directly. I think our only option is to find what these lead to before he does. The proposal hung in the air, audacious and improbable. Thomas exchanged a glance with Sarah, reading the mixture of disbelief and intrigue in her expression that surely mirrored his own. You want us to hunt for a Revolutionary War treasure, Thomas clarified, the words sounding absurd as he spoke them. We are farmers, Ms. Davidson, not historians or treasure hunters. Eleanor, please, she corrected gently. And yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. I have my father's research. You have the medallion that was entrusted to Rusty, and together we might be able to solve this before Daniel takes matters into his own hands. Sarah, ever practical, raised the obvious concern. What about our farm? We can't just abandon it, especially with Rusty there. We could move him temporarily, Thomas suggested, surprising himself with the proposal. Jim Henderson might let us keep him at his place for a few days. Eleanor nodded eagerly. And I can hire someone to watch over your property while we're gone. A security service, discreet but effective. The plan was taking shape with alarming speed. Thomas felt swept along by forces beyond his control, yet there was also a flicker of excitement beneath his apprehension. When was the last time he'd done anything beyond the endless cycle of farm work and financial worry? The prospect of adventure, however fraught with danger, held an undeniable allure. Philadelphia is a 6-hour drive from here, he noted, part of him still searching for reasons to resist this improbable quest. I'll cover all expenses, Eleanor assured him, and compensate you for your time away from the farm. Sarah touched Thomas's arm gently. It might be our best option, given the circumstances. Harrington isn't going to simply go away. Thomas nodded slowly, decision crystallizing. All right, we'll need to make arrangements for the farm and for Rusty, and I want to understand exactly what we're looking for before we go charging off to Philadelphia. Eleanor's relief was palpable. Thank you. I know this is asking a lot, but I believe it's the right course. She turned her attention back to the documents, selecting a map of Old City Philadelphia with markings in her father's handwriting. Now let's see if we can decipher what these medallions are trying to tell us. For the next hour, they pored over Edward Davidson's research, attempting to understand the connection between the medallions and the historical city layout. The medallions themselves proved to be more complex than they initially appeared. Each contained concentric rings of engraved symbols, some recognizable as letters or numbers, others more abstract. Father believed they needed to be rotated to a specific alignment, Eleanor explained, demonstrating by placing one medallion atop the other and carefully turning the top one. When the correct symbols align, they form a pattern that corresponds to landmarks on the map. Thomas, whose practical mind excelled at spatial relationships, caught on quickly. It's like a combination lock, he observed. Each position reveals different information. Exactly, Eleanor beamed. That's what makes them so ingenious, and so difficult to decipher without both pieces. As they experimented with different alignments, Sarah noticed something they had overlooked. "Look here," she said, pointing to a small notch on the edge of the silver medallion. "There's a matching one on the gold piece. Maybe they're meant to line up at these points?" Eleanor examined the notches with growing excitement. "You're right. Father mentioned something about alignment markers in his notes, but I never knew what to look for." She carefully positioned the medallions with the notches matched, then rotated them slightly until several engraved lines appeared to connect across both pieces. "There. Do you see it?" Thomas leaned closer, and suddenly the pattern jumped out at him. A crude but recognizable map of streets, with one intersection prominently marked by a small star, formed where lines from both medallions met. "That's it," he breathed. "That's the location." Eleanor compared the pattern to her father's map of 1777 Philadelphia. It corresponds to the area near Independence Hall, or what was then the Pennsylvania State House. Her finger traced the streets on the old map. "This intersection here, in modern Philadelphia, it would be near the corner of 5th and Chestnut." "That's a public area," Sarah pointed out. "Wouldn't anything hidden there have been found long ago?" "Not necessarily," Eleanor replied. "Philadelphia has layers of history built one atop another. Basements, tunnels, sealed chambers that have been forgotten for centuries." She gathered the documents with renewed purpose. "We should leave as soon as possible. Daniel won't waste time now that he knows we're working together." Thomas's thoughts turned to practical matters. "I'll need to call Jim about Rusty, and we should pack some essentials. Can we meet back here in 2 hours?" Eleanor nodded. "I'll arrange for a security service to watch your farm, and I'll see what I can find out about access to historical sites in that area of Philadelphia." As they prepared to leave, Thomas felt the weight of the silver medallion in his pocket. A simple act of compassion for an unwanted horse had thrust them into an historical mystery that spanned centuries. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of struggling to save his family's farm, salvation might come from a treasure hidden by revolutionaries nearly 250 years ago. Outside the hotel, Thomas scanned the parking lot warily before leading Sarah to their truck. No sign of Harrington or his men, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked as they pulled onto the main road, her voice caught between disbelief and excitement. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "Seems like we are. Not exactly how I planned to spend the week, but here we are." "When was the last time we left the farm for more than a day?" she mused, gazing out the window at the familiar landscape of their small town. "Our anniversary, 5 years ago. That weekend in the mountains." The memory brought a warmth to Thomas's chest, a rare respite from work that had reminded them both that they were more than just partners in survival. Sarah reached across the seat to squeeze his hand. "Whatever happens in Philadelphia, at least we're in it together." At the farm, Thomas moved with focused efficiency, gathering essentials while Sarah prepared a small travel bag. After securing the house, they headed to the stable where Rusty waited, seemingly unaware of the pivotal role he played in their unfolding drama. "We need to move you somewhere safe, old boy," Thomas murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "Just for a few days." Jim Henderson answered his call immediately, agreeing without hesitation to house Rusty in his small stable behind the feed store. "Been meaning to repay you for that fence repair last summer," he said gruffly, waving off Thomas's thanks. "Besides, sounds like you're in a bind." Thomas didn't share the full story, only that they needed to leave town briefly and had concerns about leaving Rusty alone. Jim, bless him, didn't press for details. In a small farming community, helping neighbors was simply what one did, questions optional. Loading Rusty into the borrowed trailer proved easier than Thomas expected. The horse stepped in without resistance, as if understanding the necessity of their actions. With Rusty settled at Jim's place and final instructions given regarding the other livestock, Thomas and Sarah returned to the hotel with minutes to spare before their agreed meeting time. Eleanor opened the door at their first knock, her expression a mixture of relief and tension. "Good, you're here. There's been a development." She ushered them inside, where a laptop sat open on the table, displaying a news article. This was published an hour ago. Thomas leaned in to read the headline. Historical Society announces restoration project at Independence National Historical Park. The article detailed plans for excavation and restoration of several previously inaccessible areas near Independence Hall, scheduled to begin the following week. "This can't be a coincidence," Eleanor said, her voice low with urgency. "Daniel has connections in historical preservation circles. I believe he's orchestrating this to gain access to areas that might contain what we're looking for." "So he's figured out the location too," Thomas concluded grimly. Eleanor nodded, or at least narrowed it down, which means we're running out of time. She closed the laptop with a decisive click. "Are you ready to leave?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small nod of confirmation. "As ready as we'll ever be," he replied, patting his pocket where the silver medallion rested. As they loaded their bags into Eleanor's car, Thomas cast a final glance toward the distant hills where his farm lay. For generations, the Millers had been rooted to that land, their lives defined by its boundaries. Now he was venturing beyond, chasing a mystery that had originated before his great-grandparents were born. "It'll be there when we get back," Sarah assured him, reading his thoughts as she often did. Thomas nodded, turning his back on the familiar landscape. "Let's go find this treasure." The journey to Philadelphia passed in a blur of highway miles and strategy discussions. Eleanor drove with the focused precision of someone accustomed to urban traffic, while Thomas and Sarah watched the landscape transform from rural farmland to crowded suburbs, and finally into the dense grid of the city itself. The silver medallion remained in Thomas's pocket, a constant weight that reminded him of the improbable nature of their quest. Night had fallen by the time they reached the city, the historical district illuminated by carefully placed spotlights that cast dramatic shadows across colonial-era buildings. Eleanor navigated to a boutique hotel several blocks from Independence Hall, explaining that she had reserved rooms earlier that afternoon. "We'll start our search tomorrow at first light," she said, as they retrieved their bags from the trunk. "Tonight we should review Father's notes once more and plan our approach." The hotel lobby was elegant in an understated way, with polished hardwood floors and tasteful artwork depicting scenes from American history. Thomas felt conspicuous in his work jeans and flannel shirt, acutely aware of the distance between his daily reality and this world of quiet luxury. At the check-in desk, the clerk greeted Eleanor by name, suggesting she was a frequent guest. "Ms. Davidson, welcome back. We have your usual room prepared, and the adjacent one for your friends as requested." Eleanor thanked him with the easy grace of someone comfortable in such surroundings. Thomas exchanged a glance with Sarah, both of them silently acknowledging the contrast between their new ally's life and their own. Upstairs, their room proved to be larger than Thomas had expected, with a view overlooking a tree-lined street where gas lamps cast pools of warm light on cobblestone sidewalks. Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the historic district with undisguised wonder. "It's like stepping back in time," she murmured. "Hard to believe we were looking at broken fence posts this morning." Thomas joined her at the window, the events of the past few days seeming increasingly surreal. "If someone had told me a week ago that buying an old horse would lead to this, I'd have thought they were crazy." A gentle knock at their door announced Eleanor, who had changed into more casual attire but still carried herself with the same quiet determination. She held a folder of documents and a city map marked with various notations. "I thought we might go over this together," she suggested, settling at the small table near the window. "The more eyes we have on Father's research, the better chance we have of interpreting it correctly." For the next 2 hours, they examined Edward Davidson's notes in greater detail. The man had been meticulous, documenting every historical reference to the area around Independence Hall, with particular attention to buildings that had existed during the Revolutionary period, but had since been demolished or built over. Father believed the cache was hidden in a basement or sub-basement that became inaccessible after later construction. Eleanor explained, pointing to a series of architectural diagrams. Many of these old buildings had secret rooms or passages, especially during the Revolution when privacy was essential for those planning rebellion. Thomas studied the maps with growing interest, his practical mind, honed by years of maintaining complex farm equipment with limited resources, found satisfaction in the puzzle before them. "According to the medallions, we're looking at this intersection," he said, indicating the spot where 5th Street met Chestnut. "But there's nothing there now except public buildings and tourist areas." "That's what makes it the perfect hiding place," Eleanor replied. "Hidden in plain sight, beneath the feet of thousands of visitors every day." She spread out a modern map of the area. "The challenge will be gaining access to restricted areas without alerting Harrington's people." Sarah, who had been quietly examining one of the documents, suddenly straightened. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a faded sketch in the margin of a letter. "This symbol here, it matches part of the pattern on the medallions." Eleanor leaned closer, eyes widening in recognition. "You're right. It's the same design that appears when the medallions are properly aligned." She flipped through several more pages until she found what she was looking for, a detailed drawing of a basement layout. "And here it is again, marking what appears to be a wall or perhaps a door." Thomas retrieved the silver medallion from his pocket, placing it beside the gold one that Eleanor had laid on the table. Together they formed the pattern that matched the symbol in the margin. "So we're looking for this marking somewhere in a basement near Independence Hall?" "It seems so," Eleanor nodded. "According to Father's notes, there was once a print shop at that location, operated by a known Patriot sympathizer. It would have been an ideal place to hide sensitive materials." "And what exactly are we looking for beyond this symbol?" Sarah asked. "A door? A hidden compartment?" Eleanor hesitated. Father wasn't entirely clear on that point. His notes suggest a chamber of some kind, but whether that means a room or merely a hiding space within a wall, I can't be certain. As they continued their discussion, Thomas became aware of a subtle shift in Eleanor's demeanor. A tension had crept into her shoulders, and her eyes darted occasionally toward the window, as if expecting to see someone watching them. "Is everything all right?" he asked during a lull in the conversation. Eleanor's smile was forced. "Just being cautious. Daniel has resources and I wouldn't put it past him to have people watching the hotel." She gathered her notes with slightly trembling hands. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." After Eleanor had returned to her own room, Thomas secured the door and turned to find Sarah watching him with concern. "She's scared," Sarah observed quietly. "More than she's letting on." Thomas nodded, moving to check that the window was properly locked. "This family feud goes deeper than she's told us. I get the feeling there's more at stake than just historical artifacts." "Should we be worried?" "Probably," Thomas admitted. "But we're committed now, and I don't see a way to extract ourselves without potentially making things worse." They prepared for bed in thoughtful silence, the city sounds filtering through the window, distant sirens, occasional laughter from late-night pedestrians, the hum of traffic that never entirely ceased. So different from the quiet of their farmhouse, where only natural sounds disturbed the night. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through a haze of urban pollution. Thomas woke early, habit overriding the comfort of the hotel bed. Sarah still slept peacefully beside him, and he took a moment to study her face, relaxed in sleep in a way it rarely was during waking hours. The constant worry of farm finances had etched permanent lines around her eyes over the years, though she rarely complained about their circumstances. If this unlikely treasure hunt proved successful, perhaps those worries could be eased. Thomas wasn't naive enough to expect Revolutionary War gold to solve all their problems, but even a modest financial cushion would make a world of difference to their precarious existence. A text message from Eleanor interrupted his thoughts. "Meet in lobby 7:30. Breakfast, then museum opens 9. They found Eleanor already waiting when they descended at the appointed time, dressed in casual but smart attire and nursing a cup of coffee. She looked as if she had slept even less than Thomas, but her eyes were alert and focused. "I've been thinking about our approach," she said after they had exchanged morning greetings. "The area we need to access is part of the Independence National Historical Park. Some sections are open to the public, others restricted to staff and researchers. And our target is in a restricted section," Thomas guessed. Eleanor nodded. "Based on the maps, what we're looking for would be beneath the current visitor center, in an area that was once the foundation of that print shop I mentioned." "So how do we get access?" Sarah asked, practical as always. A hint of a smile crossed Eleanor's face. "That's where my father's reputation comes in useful. He was a respected historian and benefactor to several museums in the area. I've arranged for us to meet with the site director at 9:30, supposedly to discuss a potential donation of some of Father's papers to their archive." "And this will get us into the restricted areas?" Thomas was skeptical. "It gets us through the door with a legitimate reason to be there," Eleanor clarified. "The rest will require some improvisation." After a quick breakfast at a nearby cafe, they walked the short distance to Independence Hall, the morning air crisp with early autumn coolness. The historic district was already coming alive with tourists and school groups gathering for guided tours, cameras ready to capture pieces of America's past. Thomas found himself staring up at the iconic building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed, feeling suddenly small against the backdrop of such momentous history. The silver medallion in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, a tangible connection to the men who had risked everything in this very place. "Try to look like academics," Eleanor murmured as they approached the administrative entrance at the side of the visitor center. "Follow my lead and don't volunteer any information unless asked directly." The site director, Dr. Howard Fleming, proved to be a thin, energetic man with wire-rimmed glasses and a bow tie that seemed anachronistic against his otherwise modern appearance. He greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth, clasping her hand in both of his. "Miss Davidson, such a pleasure to see you again. I was so sorry to hear about your father's passing. Edward was a giant in the field, truly irreplaceable." "Thank you, Howard. That means a great deal." Eleanor's voice carried the perfect note of subdued gratitude. "These are my colleagues, Thomas and Sarah Miller. They've been helping me catalog Father's collection." Dr. Fleming shook their hands with enthusiasm. "Wonderful to meet you both. Any friends of the Davidsons are friends of ours here at Independence National Historical Park." Thomas tried to project scholarly confidence, acutely aware of his calloused hands and the faint scent of hay that seemed permanently embedded in his clothes despite his best efforts to dress appropriately for the city. "Now then," Dr. Fleming continued, leading them through a security checkpoint and into the administrative section of the building, "I understand you're considering donating some of Edward's papers to our research collection." Eleanor launched into a detailed explanation of her father's work, peppered with historical references and scholarly terms that Thomas could barely follow. Dr. Fleming listened with rapt attention, occasionally interjecting questions or appreciative comments. As they walked, Eleanor skillfully guided the conversation toward the specific area of their interest. "Father was particularly fascinated by the buildings that once stood near this intersection," she said, gesturing toward a large architectural model of the historic district. "Especially the print shop that was here in 1777. I believe he mentioned corresponding with you about accessing the foundation level." Dr. Fleming's face lit up with recognition. "Yes, indeed. Edward was convinced there might be undiscovered artifacts in the lower levels. We conducted a partial survey at his request several years ago, though nothing significant was found at the time." "I'd be very interested in seeing that area," Eleanor said casually. Father's notes mentioned some specific features he believed might have been overlooked. The director hesitated, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Well, access is somewhat restricted these days. There's been some structural concern about the oldest sections of the foundation." He brightened suddenly. "But I suppose a brief visit would be acceptable, especially for Edward's daughter. We're conducting some preliminary work down there this week, in fact, in preparation for the restoration project." Thomas caught the flash of tension in Eleanor's eyes at this mention of the restoration, confirming their suspicion that Harrington might be behind the suddenly announced project. "That would be wonderful," Eleanor said smoothly. "If it's not too much trouble." "Not at all. Let me just get the keys and alert security that we'll be going below." Dr. Fleming bustled away, leaving them momentarily alone in the corridor. "We need to be quick," Eleanor whispered urgently. "If Daniel has influenced this restoration project, he may have people watching the site already." Before Thomas could respond, his attention was drawn to a man passing through the security checkpoint at the end of the hall, tall, with military short hair and an earpiece that suggested professional security rather than tourist or staff. The man's gaze swept the corridor with practiced efficiency, pausing briefly on their small group before continuing on his route. "I think you're right about being watched," Thomas murmured, nodding discreetly toward the man. "That doesn't look like regular museum security." Eleanor's face paled slightly. "One of Daniel's people. He must know we're here." "Should we abort?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. Eleanor shook her head firmly. "No. This might be our only chance to access the site before Daniel secures it completely. We have to continue." Dr. Fleming returned moments later, jingling a ring of keys. "All set. Security has been notified. If you'll follow me, we'll take the service elevator down to the lower level." As they moved toward the elevator, Thomas felt the weight of unseen eyes following their progress. The game was accelerating, with multiple players now positioned on the board. Whatever secrets lay hidden beneath Independence Hall, they were no longer the only ones seeking to uncover them. The service elevator descended with a low mechanical hum, carrying them past the public areas of the visitor center into the shadowy world beneath. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature as they sank below street level. Sarah stood close beside him, her shoulder touching his in silent solidarity. Eleanor maintained a poised expression, though her rapid blinking betrayed her nervousness. Dr. Fleming seemed oblivious to the tension, chattering enthusiastically about the building's history as they descended. "This structure has been modified numerous times over the centuries. What we're accessing now is a patchwork of foundations from different eras. Colonial basements alongside 19th century additions and modern reinforcements." The elevator stopped with a slight jolt, doors sliding open to reveal a concrete hallway illuminated by fluorescent lights. The stark modern corridor quickly gave way to older construction. Brick walls with visible mortar, low ceilings supported by massive wooden beams darkened with age. "The original foundation walls are through here," Dr. Fleming explained, unlocking a heavy metal door. "We've had to restrict access due to humidity concerns affecting the structural integrity, but a brief visit shouldn't pose any problems." The door swung open with a protesting creak, revealing a space that instantly transported Thomas 2 centuries into the past. Here, the modern lighting gave way to emergency lanterns placed at intervals along rough stone walls. The air carried the musty scent of old earth and dampness, with underlying notes of coal and ink that hinted at the building's former purpose. "This section dates to approximately 1770, Dr. Fleming continued, leading them carefully along the uneven floor. "It would have been the basement of Markham's print shop, where broadsides and pamphlets supporting the revolutionary cause were produced. Much of it was filled in during later construction, but we've excavated portions for historical research." Thomas's eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, taking in details that sparked his practical assessment. The foundation was solid work, massive stone blocks fitted together with precision that had withstood centuries of pressure from above. These builders had created something meant to last, working with simple tools but profound understanding of their materials. Eleanor moved with purpose, her gaze scanning the walls as if searching for something specific. "Howard, did my father ever mention looking for particular markings in this area? Symbols or engravings that might have significance?" The director adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. He was quite interested in masons' marks and owners' seals, spent hours down here with his notebooks and that peculiar magnifying glass he always carried. A fond smile crossed his face at the memory. Edward had theories about revolutionary sympathizers encoding messages in architectural elements. Fascinating stuff, though perhaps a bit speculative for academic publication. They continued deeper into the foundation, passing through a narrow archway into what appeared to be an older section. Here, the ceiling dropped even lower, forcing Thomas to duck his head. The lanterns cast elongated shadows across walls that seemed to leak centuries-old secrets through their pores. "This is as far as the public tour would ever come," Dr. Fleming noted, his voice dropping instinctively in the confined space. "Beyond this point is primarily of interest to structural engineers and historians with specific research questions." Eleanor paused, her attention caught by something on the far wall. "What's that section there? It looks different from the surrounding stonework." Dr. Fleming directed his flashlight toward the area she indicated. "Ah, good eye. That's a repair section from the early 1800s. There was some kind of collapse or intentional modification. The historical record isn't clear. We've debated excavating further behind it, but structural concerns have prevented a full investigation." Thomas moved closer, his farmer's instinct for reading land and structures guiding his assessment. The section in question was indeed distinct. The stones were similar but not identical to the surrounding wall, and the mortar pattern differed slightly. To his experienced eye, it looked less like a repair and more like a deliberate concealment. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the wall section. Dr. Fleming nodded, though his expression showed mild confusion at Thomas's sudden interest. Thomas ran his hand along the edge where the different stonework met, feeling for irregularities that might indicate a hidden opening. The wall felt solid, unyielding beneath his touch. Yet something about the arrangement nagged at him, a pattern or purpose he couldn't quite discern. "Dr. Fleming," Sarah interjected smoothly, drawing the director's attention away from Thomas's examination, "could you tell us more about the printing operation that would have been conducted here?" Edward Davidson's notes mentioned specialized equipment that might have required reinforced flooring. As the director launched into an enthusiastic explanation, Eleanor sidled closer to Thomas, speaking in a whisper barely audible over Dr. Fleming's dissertation. "The medallions," she murmured, eyes fixed on the wall. "We need to check the alignment against this section." Thomas nodded slightly, his hand moving to his pocket where the silver medallion rested. But extracting it now, with Dr. Fleming just feet away, seemed too risky. They needed a distraction or a moment of privacy. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A crackling voice emerged from the radio, clipped to Dr. Fleming's belt, requesting his presence for a situation at the main entrance. The director frowned, excusing himself. "I'm terribly sorry, but it seems there's an issue upstairs that requires my attention. Would you mind waiting here briefly? I shouldn't be more than a few minutes." "Of course," Eleanor assured him. "Take your time. We're fascinated by this space." As soon as Dr. Fleming's footsteps faded, Thomas withdrew the silver medallion from his pocket. "Quick, let's check it against the wall." Eleanor retrieved the gold medallion from her purse, and together they held the pieces up to the stonework, aligning them as they had in the hotel room. The combined pattern formed a distinctive star-shaped mark with radiating lines. "Look for something similar in the stonework," Eleanor instructed, her voice tight with urgency. "It could be subtle, worn away by time or deliberately obscured." Sarah joined the search, her keen eyes scanning the lower sections of the wall while Thomas examined the higher portions. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the distant drip of water from somewhere in the foundations. "There!" Sarah suddenly exclaimed, pointing to a section near the floor. "It's faint, but look at the pattern in the mortar." Thomas crouched beside her, Eleanor leaning over his shoulder. In the rough surface of the centuries-old mortar was a barely perceptible design, lines etched with precision that mirrored the pattern formed by the aligned medallions. "This is it," Eleanor breathed, her fingers tracing the worn marking. Father was right. Thomas pressed against the surrounding stones, seeking any indication of a hidden mechanism. The wall remained stubbornly solid. If there's a door or compartment here, it's not obvious how to access it. Eleanor studied the medallions again, frowning in concentration. In Father's notes, he mentioned something about the medallions themselves being keys, not just maps. She rotated the golden medallion slightly, aligning a specific marking with its counterpart on the silver piece. Try pressing them both into the wall pattern, matched exactly to the engraving. Thomas positioned the medallions carefully against the etched design, applying gentle pressure. Nothing happened. He increased the force slightly, and suddenly felt a subtle give in the stonework. A faint clicking sound emanated from within the wall, followed by the whisper of shifting stone. A section of the wall, no more than 3 feet square, recessed slightly and slid to one side, revealing a dark opening beyond. The movement was so smooth, so precisely engineered, that it seemed impossible for a mechanism created in the 18th century. Yet here was evidence of revolutionary-era ingenuity, functioning perfectly after nearly 250 years. "Incredible," Thomas murmured, shining his phone's flashlight into the revealed space. The beam illuminated a small chamber carved from the earth behind the foundation wall, its contents obscured by dust and shadow. "We need to hurry," Eleanor urged, glancing nervously toward the passageway where Dr. Fleming had disappeared. He could return any minute. Thomas nodded, reaching carefully into the opening. His hand encountered something solid, a wooden box, roughly the size of a small suitcase, bound with metal straps now green with age. He worked it gently free of its hiding place, surprised by its substantial weight. "Is that it?" Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "After all this time?" Eleanor nodded, her expression a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "Father spent his life searching for this. I can hardly believe we've found it." The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Thomas quickly pushed the stone door closed, hearing it lock back into place with the same subtle click. He positioned himself in front of the wall section, the box partially concealed behind his legs. Dr. Fleming reappeared, looking slightly harried. "So sorry about that. A bit of confusion with a tour group." His gaze fell to the box behind Thomas, eyebrows rising in surprise. "What have you found there?" Eleanor stepped forward smoothly. "It appears to be an old storage box. We noticed it in that alcove." She gestured vaguely toward a different section of the basement, away from the hidden compartment. "Is it something the museum staff placed here?" The director frowned, approaching to examine the box. "No, I don't believe so. This area hasn't been used for storage in my tenure." He adjusted his glasses, studying the tarnished metal straps with growing interest. "This looks period authentic, possibly 18th century. Where exactly did you say you found it?" Thomas felt a bead of sweat forming on his brow, acutely aware that they had essentially removed an historical artifact from a federal museum without authorization. Before he could formulate a response, a new voice interrupted from the passageway. "I believe I can answer that question, Dr. Fleming." Daniel Harrington stepped into the chamber, flanked by the same military-looking man Thomas had noticed earlier. Harrington's tailored suit seemed absurdly formal in the dusty basement, but his confident posture suggested he felt entirely in control of the situation. "Mr. Harrington," Dr. Fleming greeted him with evident surprise. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow's meeting about the restoration funding. I happened to be in the area and thought I'd familiarize myself with the site." Harrington's smile was cold as his gaze fixed on the wooden box. "I see my cousin has made a remarkable discovery. How fortunate that I arrived in time to witness it." Eleanor stepped protectively closer to Thomas and the box. "Daniel, still following me, I see." "Following family interests," he corrected smoothly. "That box and its contents rightfully belong to the Davidson estate, which, as you know, is under dispute." He turned to Dr. Fleming, his manner shifting to one of concerned authority. "I'm afraid my cousin has been removing items from the estate against court orders. That box should be secured until ownership can be properly determined." Dr. Fleming looked thoroughly confused, glancing between Harrington and Eleanor with growing discomfort. "I don't understand. This was found on federal property, which would make it—" "A matter for the courts to decide," Harrington interrupted. "Given the ongoing litigation regarding the Davidson estate, I suggest the box be placed in secure storage until its provenance and ownership can be legally established." Thomas felt the situation slipping away from them. Dr. Fleming was clearly uncertain whose claim to believe, but Harrington's authoritative manner and mention of legal proceedings were having their intended effect. "Perhaps we should all return upstairs and discuss this in my office," the director suggested, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by professional caution. "An excellent suggestion," Harrington agreed smoothly. He gestured toward the passageway, his security man positioning himself to block any alternative exit. "After you." Thomas clutched the box firmly, exchanging a quick glance with Sarah and Eleanor. Their brief triumph had evaporated, replaced by the sickening realization that they were now caught in a public confrontation with no clear way to secure their discovery. Whatever the box contained, Revolutionary War documents, gold, or simply historical artifacts, it seemed destined to slip from their grasp into either institutional limbo or Harrington's waiting hands. As they filed toward the passageway, Thomas felt the weight of the medallion in his pocket and the heavier burden of the box in his arms. They had solved a centuries-old puzzle only to find themselves trapped in a modern one with far more complex rules and potentially devastating consequences. The elevator ride back to the administrative level passed in tense silence. Thomas maintained his grip on the wooden box, acutely aware of Harrington's calculating gaze fixed upon it. Dr. Fleming fidgeted with his bow tie, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected conflict that had erupted in his previously orderly domain. Eleanor stood rigidly beside Thomas, her expression carefully neutral despite the rage he could sense simmering beneath her composed exterior. When they reached Dr. Fleming's office, a modest space lined with bookshelves and historical maps, the director gestured for everyone to sit. Thomas remained standing, the box held protectively against his chest. "Now then," Dr. Fleming began, clearing his throat. "Perhaps we should clarify the situation. Miss Davidson, you came here to discuss donating your father's papers, and in the process, discovered this artifact." Before Eleanor could respond, Harrington interjected smoothly. "What my cousin neglected to mention is that she has been removing items from my late uncle's estate without authorization. Items that are subject to an ongoing legal dispute." "That's not true," Eleanor countered, her voice level despite her evident anger. "My father specifically left certain personal items to me, outside the estate. This matter involves those items." Dr. Fleming's gaze shifted between them, his academic background poorly suited to mediating what appeared to be a bitter family dispute. "I see. Well, regardless of personal ownership claims, anything found within the historical site falls under federal jurisdiction. I'm afraid I'll need to secure the box until proper authorities can determine its disposition." "A sensible approach," Harrington agreed with false magnanimity. "I'm sure we all want what's best for this historical artifact." Thomas tightened his grip on the box. "With all due respect, we found this. We used information that belonged to Eleanor's father to locate it. Shouldn't we at least be allowed to see what's inside before it disappears into some government warehouse?" Dr. Fleming hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and natural curiosity. "Well, I suppose a preliminary examination would be appropriate for documentation purposes. But I must insist that nothing be removed, and photographs will need to be taken." "I have no objection," Eleanor said quickly, seeing an opportunity. "In fact, I think it's essential that the contents be documented in the presence of witnesses." Harrington's smile tightened, but he nodded agreement. "By all means. Let's see what my uncle was so determined to keep from the family." Dr. Fleming moved some papers from his desk, creating a clear space. "Mr. Miller, if you would place the box here, please." Thomas reluctantly set the box on the desk, positioning himself so that he remained between it and Harrington. The wooden container looked even older in the bright office lighting, dark oak bound with verdigris-covered metal, a simple but effective lock mechanism now seized with age. "The lock appears to be corroded shut," Dr. Fleming observed, examining it without touching. "We should call conservation staff before attempting to open it." Eleanor reached into her purse. "That won't be necessary." She withdrew the gold medallion, holding it up. "This is the key." all eyes fixed on the gleaming disc as Eleanor carefully positioned it against the lock. There was a moment of uncertainty as she adjusted the angle, then a faint click as something inside the mechanism responded. The lid loosened slightly, dust puffing from the seam. "Remarkable," Dr. Fleming breathed, his academic interest momentarily overriding administrative concerns. A custom lock mechanism from the Revolutionary era, still functional after all this time. "My ancestor was known for his mechanical ingenuity," Eleanor said, a note of pride in her voice. "He designed printing presses as well as operated them." With reverent care, she lifted the lid. The room fell silent as the box's contents were revealed. A collection of carefully preserved documents bound with faded ribbon, several small leather pouches, and what appeared to be a rolled parchment sealed with wax. Dr. Fleming immediately reached for a pair of cotton gloves from his desk drawer, his training reasserting itself. "We must be extremely careful. These documents appear to be in remarkable condition, but exposure to oils and modern air could damage them." He gently lifted the top document, unfolding it with exquisite care. The yellowed paper contained elegant script, the ink faded to brown, but still legible. "This appears to be a letter dated July 1777, signed by—" His voice faltered. "Good heavens, it's signed by Benjamin Franklin." "What?" Harrington stepped forward abruptly, all pretense of disinterest abandoned. Dr. Fleming adjusted his glasses, reading portions aloud. "Entrust to you these documents of considerable importance to our cause. The enclosed maps detail British fortifications which must not fall into enemy hands." He looked up, his academic excitement palpable. "This appears to be revolutionary intelligence correspondence, potentially of enormous historical significance." He carefully set the letter aside and examined another document. "This one references financial accounts, funds provided by French supporters, to be secured against future repayment by the Continental Congress." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the sealed parchment roll. "And this could be—" Eleanor gently intercepted his reach. "Before we proceed further, I think we should clarify something." She looked directly at Harrington, her expression hardening. "My father researched this historical cache for decades. He knew exactly what it contained and its value, both historical and monetary, and he specifically ensured that I would be the one to find it, not you, Daniel." Harrington's face flushed with anger. Edward had no right to bypass proper inheritance channels. The Davidson collection belongs to the family as a whole. "This isn't about the collection," Eleanor countered. "This is about you believing you're entitled to everything, including things that were never yours to claim." Dr. Fleming cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should focus on properly documenting these artifacts. Their historical value is incalculable. They belong in a museum collection where scholars can study them." "I agree completely," Eleanor said, surprising everyone. "That was always my father's intention. But there's more to this story than you realize." She turned to Thomas, nodding slightly. Thomas withdrew the silver medallion from his pocket, placing it beside the golden one on the desk. "This was found with Rusty, the horse I purchased at auction. Eleanor's father had hidden it there for safekeeping." Dr. Fleming looked between the medallions with growing fascination. These were the keys to locating the box. Extraordinary security measures for the time period. "They were more than just keys," Eleanor explained. "According to my father's research, the two medallions together confirmed the authenticity of the documents. A primitive but effective verification system." Harrington made a dismissive gesture. "Fascinating history lesson, but it doesn't change the legal reality. As co-executor of Edward's estate, I have every right to—" "You have no rights to these items," Eleanor interrupted, her voice suddenly steel. "And I can prove it." She reached into the box and carefully extracted a sealed envelope that had been hidden beneath the other documents. Unlike the yellowed Revolutionary-era papers, this appeared to be modern stationery. "My father left this for whoever found the box. I believe it will clarify matters considerably." She broke the seal and removed several folded papers, quickly scanning their contents. Her expression shifted from tension to vindication as she read. As I thought. This is a notarized letter from my father dated 2 weeks before his death, legally donating this entire historical cache to the National Archives, with the stipulation that I would be the one to present it once found. Dr. Fleming's eyebrows rose. A posthumous donation? Father knew he was dying, Eleanor explained, her voice softening. But he wanted the discovery to happen organically, through the proper solving of the historical puzzle. He believed that whoever put in the effort to understand the medallions and locate the box would appreciate its contents more fully. She handed the letter to Dr. Fleming, who adjusted his glasses and read carefully. This appears to be in order. Edward Davidson explicitly donates the contents of the Franklin Cache to the National Archives, with Ms. Eleanor Davidson designated as the official presenter. He looked up at Harrington. This would supersede any estate claims, Mr. Harrington. Your uncle made his intentions quite clear. Harrington's face darkened with rage. This is preposterous. A convenient letter appearing at just the right moment. I'll have my lawyers challenge this immediately. You're welcome to try, Eleanor replied calmly. But the letter is notarized by Judge Thornton, who, as you know, has no particular fondness for either of us and would have no reason to favor me. Father knew exactly what he was doing. Thomas watched the exchange with a growing sense that the balance of power had shifted. Harrington's confident demeanor had cracked, revealing the desperate frustration beneath. Whatever he had hoped to gain from the cache, money, prestige, or simple victory over Eleanor, was slipping from his grasp. Dr. Fleming, seeming relieved that the matter might resolve without further conflict in his office, turned his attention back to the historical documents. These really should be examined by conservation specialists as soon as possible. The National Archives will want to send their own team. Of course, Eleanor agreed. Though there is one more aspect we haven't addressed. She carefully opened one of the small leather pouches, tipping its contents onto a clean sheet of paper on the desk. Gold coins spilled out. Not modern currency, but heavy, irregular pieces that gleamed dully in the office lighting. Dr. Fleming inhaled sharply, recognizing their significance immediately. Spanish doubloons, he breathed, probably part of the French financial support channeled through Spain. He carefully picked up one coin with his gloved fingers, examining the mint mark. Mid-18th century and remarkable condition. The numismatic value alone would be substantial. Eleanor opened a second pouch, revealing more coins, these bearing different markings. French louis d'or, she identified. And I believe the third pouch contains British guineas that were likely captured or acquired through intelligence operations. Thomas stared at the small fortune spread across the desk. Even with his limited knowledge of antiquities, he understood that these coins would be worth far more than their weight in gold due to their historical significance and excellent preservation. The monetary items are also included in the donation, Eleanor clarified, gesturing to the letter in Dr. Fleming's hands, though Father specified that a finder's reward should be paid from their value. She turned to Thomas and Sarah, her expression softening. That's where you two come in. As the technical discoverers of the cache, you're entitled to a percentage of the valuation. Thomas blinked in surprise. Us? But you're the one who knew what to look for. I had my father's research, Eleanor acknowledged. But without you finding Rusty and the silver medallion, without your practical insights in the basement, we wouldn't be having this conversation. She smiled warmly. Besides, I think my father would approve. He always said historical discoveries should benefit those who truly appreciate their significance, not just academics or institutions. Harrington, who had been silently seething, suddenly pushed away from the desk. This is far from over, Eleanor. The courts will have the final say about Edward's estate and his mental competence when these supposed instructions were written. The courts have already spoken, Daniel, Eleanor replied evenly. Judge Thornton's involvement ensured this donation was legally separate from the estate proceedings. You've lost this round, just as Father knew you would. The finality in her tone seemed to penetrate even Harrington's stubborn determination. With a last venomous glare at the assembled group, he stormed from the office, his security man following close behind. In the silence that followed his departure, Dr. Fleming exhaled heavily. Well, that was rather more excitement than we typically experience in historical preservation. He looked at the documents and coins with renewed wonder. This is truly a remarkable discovery. The National Archives will be ecstatic. Thomas felt Sarah's hand slip into his, squeezing gently in shared amazement at the turn of events. What had begun as a simple act of compassion for an unwanted horse had led them to an historical treasure trove, and, potentially, financial security they had never imagined possible. Eleanor carefully began returning the items to the box. We should notify the archives immediately. They'll want to send a secure transport team. She glanced up at Thomas and Sarah, a smile warming her previously tense features. And then I think we have a horse to check on. Rusty deserves to know his mission was accomplished. Thomas nodded, the mention of Rusty bringing him back to the practical reality that had always been his anchor. Regardless of Revolutionary War treasures and family feuds, there was still a farm waiting for their return, animals needing care, and a faithful old horse who had carried a secret far more valuable than anyone could have guessed. 3 months passed with remarkable swiftness. Winter settled over the Miller farm, dusting the fields with frost and turning breath to vapor in the crisp morning air. Thomas stood on the porch, coffee mug warming his hands as he surveyed the transformed landscape before him. The eastern field, once cracked and barren from drought, had been properly irrigated with a new system that drew from a recently drilled well. The fence line gleamed with fresh posts and wire, no longer a patchwork of temporary repairs. The barn roof, which had leaked for more seasons than Thomas cared to remember, now stood sound and weather-tight, protecting new equipment stored beneath its sturdy beams. So much had changed in such a short time, yet the essence of the place remained. This was still the Miller farm, still the land his grandfather had worked and his father had expanded. But now it carried the promise of continuity, rather than the shadow of imminent loss. Sarah emerged from the house, wrapping a woolen shawl around her shoulders as she joined him at the railing. Jim called. He's bringing those Holstein heifers by this afternoon if you're still interested. Thomas nodded, smiling at the thought of expanding their small dairy herd. The new pasture is ready for them. Should give us a good increase in milk production by spring. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the distant tree line. The finder's fee from the National Archives had transformed their financial situation entirely. The mortgage was paid in full, the most pressing repairs completed, and there remained a cushion in the bank that promised security for years to come. Yet Thomas had been careful not to change too much too quickly. The hardships of recent years had taught him the value of cautious planning. Rather than splurging on unnecessary luxuries, he and Sarah had focused on improvements that would make the farm more productive and sustainable. Investments in the future rather than indulgences in the present. I think your father would be proud, Sarah said softly, as if reading his thoughts. You've honored his legacy while building something stronger. Thomas's throat tightened with emotion. I hope so. He took a steadying breath. Speaking of legacies, Eleanor's coming by later. Says she has news about the Historical Society's evaluation. The relationship with Eleanor Davidson had evolved from their unlikely adventure into a genuine friendship. After the National Archives had secured the revolutionary cache, which historians were now calling the Franklin Papers, due to the significant correspondence from the founding father, Eleanor had remained in contact, visiting the farm regularly. She had taken a particular interest in Rusty, who now occupied a special place in the farm's hierarchy. The old horse had his own comfortable stall in the renovated barn, complete with extra bedding and premium feed that Thomas jokingly referred to as the royal treatment. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Thomas recognized Eleanor's modest sedan pulling into the driveway, followed by an unfamiliar truck. Sarah raised an eyebrow questioningly, but Thomas could only offer a shrug in response. They hadn't expected additional guests. Eleanor emerged from her car with her usual poised energy, waving cheerfully as she approached the porch. From the truck stepped a middle-aged man with weathered features and the purposeful movements of someone who worked with animals professionally. Thomas, Sarah, Eleanor greeted them warmly. "I hope you don't mind the surprise. This is Dr. Mason, an equine specialist from the university's veterinary program." Dr. Mason climbed the porch steps, extending a calloused hand. "Pleasure to meet you both. Eleanor's told me quite a story about your horse." Thomas shook the offered hand, his curiosity piqued. "Is something wrong with Rusty?" "Not at all," Eleanor assured him quickly. "But there's more to his story than we initially realized. Perhaps we could see him while we talk." They made their way to the barn, where Rusty greeted them with a soft nicker of recognition. The horse looked remarkably transformed from the neglected animal Thomas had purchased at auction. His coat now shone with health, the ribs no longer visible beneath a proper layer of flesh. While the limp remained, it seemed less pronounced, and his eyes held a bright alertness that spoke of contentment. Dr. Mason approached the stall with professional interest, running experienced hands along Rusty's neck and flanks. "Magnificent specimen, despite the old injuries. You've done excellent work rehabilitating him." "He's responded well to basic care," Thomas said, modest as always about his achievements. "Nothing special, just regular feeding and decent shelter." "I beg to differ," Dr. Mason replied, examining Rusty's legs with careful attention. "Many would have written off a horse in his condition. Your commitment has made all the difference." He straightened, turning to face them with newfound respect. "Especially considering what he is." "What he is?" Sarah echoed, confused. Eleanor stepped forward, her expression bright with excitement. "That's why I brought Dr. Mason. After the archives began cataloging the Franklin cache, I became curious about Rusty's connection to my father. It seemed odd that Dad would entrust something so valuable to a random horse. So I did some digging through his personal records and found references to a breeding program he had supported decades ago, an effort to preserve the bloodlines of the Narragansett Pacer." Dr. Mason nodded, taking up the explanation. The Narragansett Pacer was America's first distinct breed of horse, developed in New England during the colonial period. They were prized for their smooth gait and endurance. George Washington rode one, as did many revolutionary leaders. But they went extinct, Eleanor continued. By the early 1800s, the pure bloodline had disappeared through crossbreeding and changing transportation needs. Thomas looked at Rusty with new interest. "You're saying he's related to this extinct breed?" "More than related," Dr. Mason confirmed. "Based on the DNA testing we've conducted using hair samples Eleanor provided, Rusty carries genetic markers consistent with historical descriptions of the Narragansett Pacer. He's part of an extremely rare line that preserves significant portions of that original colonial breed." Sarah moved closer to the stall, gently stroking Rusty's nose. "So he's historically significant in his own right." "Precisely," Eleanor beamed. "My father wasn't just using Rusty as a hiding place for the medallion. He was preserving two treasures simultaneously, the Revolutionary cache and a living link to America's equestrian heritage." Thomas shook his head in amazement. "And I bought him for $50 because nobody else wanted him." "The universe works in mysterious ways," Eleanor said softly. "Dad would say it wasn't coincidence but providence that brought Rusty to someone who would value him beyond his apparent worth." Dr. Mason cleared his throat. "There's more to consider here. Rusty's genetic profile makes him extremely valuable to conservation breeding programs. Several universities and historical farms would be interested in his bloodline for preservation efforts." Thomas felt a sudden tightness in his chest. "You're suggesting we sell him?" "Not necessarily," the veterinarian clarified. "But allowing collection of genetic material for breeding purposes would be tremendously valuable to historical conservation. There would be compensation, of course." Eleanor touched Thomas's arm gently. "It would be entirely your decision. Rusty is your horse, but I thought you should know his full value and the role he could play in preserving American heritage." Thomas approached the stall, looking into Rusty's intelligent eyes. The horse nudged his hand affectionately, seemingly unaware of his newfound importance in the historical record. Here was yet another unexpected twist in a story that had already defied all reasonable expectations. "I'll need to think about it," Thomas said finally. "Not about whether to participate in the breeding program. That seems worthwhile. But about the best arrangement for Rusty's well-being? Dr. Mason nodded approvingly. A responsible approach. There's no rush. He's in excellent hands here. That much is obvious. After showing Dr. Mason around the rest of the farm and discussing potential breeding arrangements, they returned to the house for coffee. The kitchen, like the rest of the farm, showed subtle signs of prosperity. New appliances that had replaced decades-old models, fresh paint on the walls, curtains that Sarah had finally had time to sew after years of making do with the old ones. As they settled around the table, Eleanor withdrew an envelope from her purse. "I almost forgot. The National Archives sent this for you. The final accounting of the finder's fee, now that all the items have been fully evaluated." Thomas accepted the envelope with a sense of unreality that still hadn't entirely faded, even after months of adjusting to their changed circumstances. Inside was a check with a figure that made him blink twice to ensure he wasn't misreading the number. "This is more than we expected," he said, passing the check to Sarah, whose eyes widened appreciably. "The gold coins were worth significantly more than the initial estimate," Eleanor explained. "Several were extremely rare specimens, and their provenance as part of the Franklin cache increased their value substantially." Sarah carefully returned the check to the envelope, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of unexpected wealth. "This changes things. We could expand the dairy operation considerably, maybe even add that organic certification we've been considering." Thomas nodded, already calculating potential improvements and expansions. Unlike many sudden windfalls that led to reckless spending, this one would be invested back into the land that had sustained his family for generations. The farm wouldn't just survive, it would thrive and grow, creating a legacy for future generations of millers. Should Michael ever decide to return to his roots, or perhaps have children of his own someday. "I have one more piece of news," Eleanor said, her expression turning more serious. "Daniel has dropped his challenge to Father's will. The court issued a final ruling last week, affirming my position as primary heir and rejecting his claims of undue influence." "That's wonderful," Sarah exclaimed. "Does this mean the harassment is finally over?" Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her features. "I believe so. The discovery of the Franklin cache and Father's explicit instructions regarding its donation seem to have taken the fight out of him. Or perhaps his lawyers finally convinced him that further litigation would be fruitless. Either way, it's a weight lifted," Thomas observed. "For all of us." As the afternoon progressed, their conversation shifted to future plans. Eleanor had accepted a position with the National Archives, helping to catalog and research the very collection her father had spent his life studying. The Davidson family home would be maintained as her residence, though she spoke of eventually converting part of it into a small museum dedicated to Revolutionary history. When it came time for their visitors to depart, Thomas walked them to their vehicles. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the frost-covered fields. Dr. Mason shook Thomas's hand firmly. "Think about what we discussed. Whatever you decide regarding Rusty's role in the breeding program, you've already done a service to historical preservation by saving him in the first place." After the veterinarian drove away, Eleanor lingered a moment longer. "Sometimes I wonder if Father somehow orchestrated all of this," she mused, looking toward the barn where Rusty was comfortably settled. He was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, seeing connections and possibilities that others missed. Thomas smiled at the thought. "If he did, I'm grateful to have been part of his plan." "Will you keep Rusty here permanently?" Eleanor asked. "He would certainly be welcome at my place if you ever needed an alternative arrangement." "He belongs here," Thomas said with quiet certainty. "This is his home now. Besides, Sarah would never forgive me if I let him go. She spoils him worse than I do." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright in the crisp air. "He deserves it, after carrying such an important secret for so long." She embraced Thomas briefly before getting into her car. "I'll be back next month. Take care of yourselves, and that special horse." Thomas watched her drive away, then turned to survey his farm in the fading light. The building stood solid against the winter landscape, no longer threatening to surrender to time and neglect. The fields lay dormant, but prepared for spring planting, promised renewal rather than continued struggle. From the barn came Rusty's soft nickering, a reminder of how unexpectedly life could change course. Thomas had purchased the horse out of simple compassion, seeing value where others saw only burden and expense. That single act of kindness had set in motion events he could never have anticipated, transforming not just his financial circumstances, but his understanding of his place in the continuing American story. As he walked back toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows, and Sarah waited with plans for their future, Thomas reflected that perhaps this was the greatest treasure revealed by the old horse's secret. Not gold or historical documents, but the reminder that acts of compassion carried their own unpredictable power, connecting past to present to future, in ways that transcended mere calculation of worth. In saving Rusty, Thomas had preserved not just a living link to America's past, but his own family's future on the land they loved. It was a legacy worth more than all the revolutionary gold hidden beneath Philadelphia's historic streets, a legacy built on the simple recognition of value in what others had deemed worthless. And that, Thomas decided as he climbed the porch steps toward home, was a secret worth discovering indeed.